Thank you very much indeed, Tom, and let me say another big welcome to our other visitors who have joined us this evening. I'll just say briefly a few words about the background to the hearing. The establishment of the Commission arises out of a promise made in the Labour election manifesto in last year's local elections. As a Commission, we have two tasks. One is to explore ways in which tenants and residents in general might be given more control over the future of their homes and estates. In other words, we're looking at the future governance of council housing in Hammersmith and Fulham. Our second task is to look at ways in which more investment might be secured for council housing in Hammersmith and Fulham to improve housing services and perhaps to build more social housing. Now, there's nothing unusual about the tasks that we've been given. In housing jargon, it's known as a strategic housing stock options appraisal, and it looks at the condition of the housing stock, the future costs of repairs and modernisation, how to pay for them, and how residents can affect decisions taken about their council housing. And such stock options appraisals have been carried out scores of times, hundreds of times up and down the country. But there is one important difference here in Hammersmith and Fulham. These stock option appraisals are normally carried out by council officers and other experts behind closed doors. The unique aspect of what's happening here in Hammersmith and Fulham is that the appraisal is being carried out by a commission comprised of 9 residents and 4 independent outsiders, and the residents on the commission will have the final say in what is recommended. And the appraisal is being carried out in public because we wanted residents to be confident that our proceedings were as open, as transparent, and as honest as possible. So you, as the audience, have an active role in the hearings, the important role of witnessing the work of the Commission. You are the public part of the equation. And I want to emphasise that there are no foregone conclusions. We're completely open-minded. Yes, we'll consider what a stock transfer has to offer. Equally, we'll explore what is achievable under retention. That is to say, the council remaining as the landlord. And all the time, we'll have 2 abiding objectives: giving residents greater control over their homes and providing excellent housing services and meeting housing needs, whilst at the same time recognising that the wishes of residents are paramount and that services need to be affordable. I want to emphasise it's not the job of the Commission to decide the future of council homes in Hammersmith and Fulham. It's the job of the Commission to make a recommendation to the Council about the way forward. It will then be for the Council to decide what recommendation to adopt. Above all, any proposal affecting the future ownership of council homes, if it comes to that, will be decided by tenants in a ballot. The residents are in charge, and that's as it should be. So, we continue our work as a Commission today with one straightforward and basic question: what would be the impact on rents and service charges? And I'm going to ask one of our independent experts on the Commission, Peter Bevington, to introduce these proceedings. Peter, over to you.
Thank you, Keith. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. As you will know, we have, at each of our hearings, been separating out one of the themes that we need to look at in trying to contrast where council housing is currently within the borough and where it might be in the future at the outcome of the Commission's findings and the Council's decision based on those findings. We've looked at a number of themes already. We've looked at housing services, regeneration, investment, tenants' rights, and tonight we're going to focus on rents and service charges. Rents and service charges clearly are the lifeblood of any landlord organisation, but equally for tenants and leaseholders, very often housing costs are the major item of expenditure that they have to pay for. So the interdependence of landlord and tenants and leaseholders around rents and service charges is a very acute and important relationship. And what we have to do this evening is to first of all understand the way in which rents and service charges work currently within the borough, and then look at what the possible options of different models of ownership might involve as far as a change to the basis of rents and service charges, the help that's available to people on low incomes, the impact on business plan of a future organisation, and learn as much as we can from our witnesses about this subject of rents and service charges. So I'll hand over to Keith.
Thanks very much, Peter. And in our first session, we have a group of witnesses from Hammersmith and Fulham, officers here in housing in Hammersmith and Fulham. And I'm going to invite them in turn to say a little about themselves and what they do. And let me turn first to Kath Corbett to say welcome again, Kath. You were with us at our last hearing at the White City, and it's very nice to see you again. Why don't you tell us a bit about yourself and what you do?
Okay, and we can check the mic works as well. My name's Kath Corbett. I have two roles. I'm one of two lead directors for housing for Hammersmith and Fulham, and I am Director for Finance and Resources, which means that I look after basically all the money, so finance, rent income, leaseholder service charges, and also some kind of IT type roles as well, and sort of general back office stuff. Okay, so that's me. I'll pass you over to Duncan now. This mic is being a bit funny with me. There we go.
Okay, thank you, Kath. Hello, everyone. My name's Duncan Brown. I'm the acting head of rent income. Love working in social housing. The reason for that is the challenges within a rent income team is about fundamentals, making sure that the money comes in, and secondly, making sure that where it's a case of can't pay for residents, where there are different circumstances that come up, that the team can actually respond to that, be sympathetic, and provide a range of options for if residents wish to be signposted elsewhere, or over time the role of rent income teams has very much changed from solely being enforcement to a lot more support. So therefore we're very keen for the team all to be able to respond to residents in a positive and sympathetic way.
Hi, my name is Paul Gully. I'm the head of financial investment and strategy for housing. I've been at Hammersmith now for just 6 weeks, so it's a bit of a baptism of fire for me, but very much looking forward to getting involved. Previously to working in Hammersmith and Fulham, I was based at Hounslow for 2.5 years. I was at Westminster for 4 years before that, and Wandsworth for 10 years before that. I've done quite a bit of work in housing in the past. I don't quite know the nuances of Hammersmith and Fulham, but I should be able to answer questions in kind of very general terms as they're raised, to the extent that obviously Kath passes them over to me. So we'll move on from there. Thank you.
Paul, Kath, and Duncan, thank you all very much indeed. When Paul told me before we started the meeting that he'd been here for only 6 weeks, I said I'd make sure that we focused our questions on him in that case. I don't really mean that, Paul, but obviously we look forward to your contributions. Can I just remind all my colleagues and participants that ideally the microphone should be held 3 or 4 inches away from the probably mouth, so to avoid excessive echo on the thing. So let me kick off the questioning with a question to Kath. Kath, can you tell us how are rents controlled in the social housing sector, and how does the council set rents and rent increases?
Okay, so in terms of the sector, there's some rent guidance that's been produced, and that's produced by governance, and that sets a guideline that rent increases should be at no more than CPI, that's the Consumer Price Index, which is a measure of inflation or how much prices go up by, plus 1%. Now, there was historically, going back to the early 2000s, I'm going to go slowly, to try and make sure I explain it properly. So if you go back to 2001, then 2001, there was this regime in place called rent restructuring. Rent restructuring was based on government guidance as well. The idea of rent restructuring was basically to ensure that if you lived in a similar type of council or housing association property in the same area, then you would pay a consistent level of rent ultimately for it, because rents were a bit all over the place. And under rent restructuring, rent convergence happened, and rent convergence was everybody's rent slowly moving up towards what was known as a target rent. Target rent was set for each property based on a number of different factors. It was based mostly on the size of the property, the valuation of the property, and the wages within the local area. Okay? So lots and lots of people were not paying target rents, and people moved up to target rent at RPI plus 1% plus £2 normally. Some people were actually paying over target rents in some places, and they moved down by minus £2 every year, so especially more so outside of London. Okay, so the idea was ultimately that everybody ended up converged and paying the same rent, and or not the same rent, but same rent for the same type of property. Okay, now that was supposed to have happened by 2015-16. However, in practice, in the real world, that didn't happen, and there are lots and lots of people who aren't fully converged and aren't yet paying target rent. Okay, and that's Hammersmith and Fulham has only about 10% of its tenants currently paying target rent. So we converge, if we do it at plus £1, which is what we did it at last year, we converge at about 10% a year. Okay. Now, in terms of one of the key differences between the way the council sets rents and the way a housing association is regulated in terms of rent increases, housing associations have their regulator, and their regulator takes that government guidance and basically makes it into something that they have to comply with. Whereas for the council, we just have to have due regard to it. So we don't have to comply with the government guidance. So that's what enabled us last year to come out and have that conversation with you about saying, well, actually, we could just increase rents at CPI plus 1%, or we could increase rents at CPI plus 1%, plus we'll only increase them by £1 to do convergence towards target rent, rather than £2. And if we do that, it meant at the time, and it still does, it means that we can continue to put some investment into the stock to pick up on all the things that Decent Homes didn't cover. And if we hadn't done that, that would have meant that we weren't going to end up with things like lifts that were over 40 years old. We wouldn't be able to do double glazing in a lot of the street properties. We'd have a problem doing the work that we're currently doing out on the White City estate, where we're spending quite a lot of money refurbishing and improving the stock. So we had that conversation with tenants at the Policy and Accountability meeting, and at what was then called the TRA forums, which is now the Housing Representative Forums. So we all had a talk about it, and we got people to vote, and the tenants that were there voted in favour of the CPI plus 1% plus £1. If we were to go to if the stock was to go to a housing association, whether it be a standalone one or whether it be an existing one, then the chances are the rents would be constrained at CPI plus 1% unless an agreement was reached with the regulator that there was a specific financial reason not to do so. And I think a few people across the country do actually have those.
So, Kath, I mean, at the end of this year, what proportion of tenants will be paying the target rent, the level of convergence having only been 10% at the beginning of the year?
So it will be between 10 and 20%. I don't actually have the exact figure right in front of me because it will vary depending on how people move in and out of the stock. So as people move out and we relet properties, we relet at target rent. So it depends a bit on your turnover.
And what would be, is it possible to identify, as it were, an average rent and an average target rent to see what the gap would be in pounds between those levels of rent?
It is, and I don't have all the numbers in my head. I know our average rent is currently about £107, and the target rent is, I think, Paul is looking at me and nodding. I'm not sure if he knows the average off the top of his head, not for target rent, but it's about £20 more, I think.
It's about £20.
Yeah.
And is there a policy to reach that, to converge on that target?
Yes,
across the board?
there is currently.
And over what period of time?
Over as long as it takes, so at plus £1. Because we recognise that we don't want to give tenants really big rent increases, and we want to constrain the level of rent increases. And in fact, the current administration's policy is to have lower rent increases than were being put through previously. So the previous business plan relied on the old rent guidance continuing, and that would have been RPI plus 0.5% plus £2.
And you mentioned the business plan for housing in Hammersmith, which we dealt with at our last meeting. Presumably, there are some built-in assumptions about rent changes into the 40-year business plan. What would they be?
So they are at the CPI plus 1% plus £1 until you reach target rent, and then when a tenant reaches target rent, the rent for that particular property is increased at just CPI plus 1%. And the increases for service charges, bearing in mind tenants also pay service charges because we depooled service charges back in 2012, and they are at CPI only because the majority of our contracts are linked into CPI.
Peter wants to ask a question.
Cass, could I ask, you mentioned the conversation that you had with tenants' reps last year that, if you like, gave you the mandate to peg rents at a level that enabled you to do some extra investment. Once you've reached target rents, do you still have the flexibility to negotiate with tenants about a rent increase above target rents that would enable you to carry out additional investment?
As the legislation stands at present, and as guidance stands at present, and as regulation stands at present, if the stock stays within the council, yes, we do.
Shirley, you wanted to come in.
Just to try and get my head around this. So I understand what you're saying about the council rents. If there was a stock transfer, and so it wouldn't happen, couldn't happen, but supposing there was a stock transfer next week, and so suddenly the estates had a different landlord, a housing association type of landlord, would the rules that exist mean that there would inevitably be an increase in rents under the new regime?
No, I think is the answer. Actually, we have had this discussion back at the office, and actually one of the things that we think when we're modelling the stock transfer option as part of the options appraisal is that we will only model the rent increase at CPI plus 1%, because we think that to model at CPI plus 1% plus £1 on the assumption that the regulator might agree in the long term for us to continue doing that is just too risky in terms of going to a funder.
So the regulator who can make housing associations comply with the rules, they can't make them hike the rents up suddenly. Because I think that's one of the big ideas.
That would be a risk, and I think that's a risk on both sides, isn't it? So if you stay within the council, currently we have to have due regard to the to the guidance. That means that whatever elected party you've got, to some extent, to a large extent, can just basically choose what to do with the rents without actually having to come and talk to you as tenants. Now, as it happens, the current administration were very, very strong on wanting to come and talk to you as tenants and about what we wanted to put rents up by versus what the investment requirements were of the stock. Okay, if you went out to a standalone housing association that had maybe a tenant majority on the board or a resident majority on the board, you would still to some extent be in that position because you as residents, through the resident majority on the board, would have control over what happened in terms of rents, because as always, there's always going to be things happen. There will be funding decisions, there might be something come up that means that there has to be some more money found in the business plan from somewhere, whether it be from rent or whether it be from costs. house. So if you were out as a standalone association with a resident majority on the board, it would be basically because of the resident majority on the board, the residents deciding still. If you were out to a larger association or an association without a resident majority on the board, well, then you would be in the hands of whoever was on the board, and that would depend on their view. It would depend on where they sat on the spectrum of what was important to tenants and what was important to funders. Because remember, if you were in a housing association and you were in a position where you might have to put rents up by more, it is probably because you've got a problem with your money somewhere and your funders are putting pressure on you. Your other big danger, of course, is some sort of national regulation, and that could come at you from any direction. The other thing is probably worth remembering, one more thing, is just if you were bidding for grant money as a housing association to do new development, then that often or normally comes with an expectation that you will do some conversion of your existing stock from social rent to affordable rent. But that doesn't impact on current tenants as it's currently drafted.
Well, I wanted to ask you about affordable rents, and I think you've probably given me the answer, but that would prevent me asking the question again. But just to be entirely clear, Kath, because I think your last answer was really ever so helpful. The level of rents would not depend on any, as it were, contract between the stock transfer company and residents at the point of transfer. The level of rents going forward would essentially depend upon the decisions made by residents on the board of the stock transfer company. So it's a matter of democratic decision making under the new governance arrangements rather than anything that you could build in as a condition of the transfer.
Yes, because I think it would be very difficult to build it in as a condition of the transfer, because I don't think the funders would like it, I think.
I'm very tempted to pursue on that, but I think we may have another hearing in which we can pursue on those issues. I'll be very brief. You mentioned affordable rents. Just to confirm that government policy on affordable rents does not apply to council rents.
It's guidance only. We have to have due regard to it, but if we've got a good case, so like extra investment, then we do not have to follow it.
Fine. Anthony, I think you've got a question for Kath, and then we'll move on to other witnesses.
Yes, Kath. I want to quote to you from the current administration's manifesto, which stated that rents for sheltered housing had increased to twice those of general needs, presumably over the lifetime of the previous administration. Can you actually confirm that and explain why?
I don't have the stats in front of me to be able to absolutely confirm those particular statistics. I suspect where that's coming from is the sheltered housing charge. And the sheltered housing charge has a complex history. So sheltered tenants, in addition to their basic rent, pay what's called a sheltered housing charge. The sheltered housing charge actually funds the more intensive housing management that the sheltered tenants receive. So they have much smaller patch sizes, they get visits from their housing officers on a weekly basis, assuming they don't decide to opt out. They get a much more intensive service. They also benefit from a handyman service and a few other bits and pieces. Now, going right back historically under the old administration, in about I think it was about 2009, because this all happened before I came to the council. That element of the service was funded by Supporting People grant. There were cuts in the Supporting People grant, I think, and this is just my understanding because I wasn't there at the time. And there had to be another mechanism had to be developed to enable the tenants to continue to receive that intensive housing management. So therefore, it was originally conceived as a housing benefit fundable service charge. So the sheltered housing charge was born. Okay, now when we came in and we started looking at that in more detail, actually when we depooled service charges and we really thought about it, it's not actually really a true service charge. So they're not paying for an on-site warden service, they're not paying for, I don't know, electricity, they're not paying for grounds maintenance as part of that charge. That's all separate. So we thought the most honest thing to do at the time, under the previous administration, was to say, actually, you know what, that's actually part of your rent charge, and it's an extra charge that you pay because you get a more intensive service in terms of the housing management, rather than it being something that's service chargeable. And part of the reason for doing that was to try and protect that in terms of changes in benefit regulations going forward, to make sure that people didn't get caught out and suddenly find that that couldn't be funded by housing benefits. Okay, so that I think is one of the key reasons why, if you went back and you did it as a pure benchmarking exercise, you probably would, or you would find a significantly larger increase in what your rent letter says in terms of your rent charge compared to what it is for a general needs tenant. However, I think what people care about at the end of the day is how much they have to pay in total, isn't it? And that is the total of your rent, your service charge, and in your case of housing, sheltered housing tenants, your rent includes your sheltered housing charge now. Before it was part of your service charge, so that total comes back the same. And your water charge. So I think what's important is the movement in that overall total charge. I hope that answers your question.
You actually answered my second supplementary question as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know really who this is for, Paul, I think maybe. What elements of housing expenditure do rents pay for, and how are they collected?
Sorry, how are the rents collected?
Yes, how are they collected?
I'll pass that to Duncan for the rent collected. Essentially, the rents that are ploughed into the business plan are used to fund revenue and capital work. So essentially, to the extent that rent income is not used to fund the day-to-day operation of that revenue account, it's those surplus funds are then used to support a fund which effectively pays for ongoing capital works. Now, the fund itself is quite over time, it's built up to a significant balance at the moment. However, there is going to be quite a need to draw down on that fund in the short term and over the next few years to make good some of the works that are required on the estates, make good some of the estates. In addition to that, the council will probably have to utilise quite significant levels of borrowing to fund the works which are required. So the rents certainly support those works, but in themselves do not fully support the amount of work that is required to keep the stock, maintain the stock at a decent level, and at the same time deliver some of the promises that have been made in various manifestos. I'll pass over to Duncan to talk on the rent collection.
I'll just add a tiny bit of clarity over the top of that. So the rents cover your basic housing management service, they cover your day-to-day maintenance service, and they cover your long-term maintenance of the stock, and they cover the interest payments on the existing and any future debt. And as Paul says, we do have a business plan where the debt rises up to a peak before being repaid currently, because we have some backlog in terms of our planned works that we need to address. I think we talked about last time in terms of the business plan itself. Okay. In terms of service charges, that works slightly differently. So service charges, those of you that are tenants will be aware that you get an itemised service charge that's based on the services received in your block. So you pay for those separately to the rent. You also pay separately to the rent for your water charges as well. And I'll let Duncan talk about collecting it.
To answer the question directly, how are they collected? Well, they're charged weekly in advance each Monday over 52 weeks of the year. And there's a wide variety of payment methods ranging from paying in cash at the post office through to direct debit and a whole host of other payment methods. And if anyone was to get in arrears, they get notified very promptly at the start, and each resident is sent a statement of account on a quarterly basis. And I will save sort of answers if there are any follow-up or further questions later about a bit more detail.
Right, Shirley.
Another one for you, Kath. Could you tell us how leaseholder charges are set, please? What they pay for, and can you also explain the cap on leaseholder charges, how that operates in London?
Right. First of all, leaseholder service charges. So leaseholder service charges work slightly different to how tenant service charges work. So if I first of all just say with tenant service charges, when we took the decision to depool service charges, we decided to depool on the basis of specific calculations for each block. Not all London authorities did that. Some of them just depooled a general service charge across the piece. But what we wanted to do was we wanted to make sure you understood the services you should be getting in your block, and then you would be able to tell us if there was something up with those services as well. Not that we shouldn't know anyway, but it just helps us be more accountable to tenants. Okay, and we depooled those service charges on what's called a fixed basis, so that actually, except for water rates, which are covered by a different regime, what we charge you in April for service charges as a tenant is what your bill will be at the end of the year. So there's no reconciliation exercise. For leaseholders, it works slightly differently. For leaseholders, they have the same service charges that tenants get, okay, but instead of getting billed just on an estimated amount, okay, that averages out over time, they get billed on an estimated amount at the start of the year, and then when we've closed the year-end accounts, in the September following the year-end that we've just finished, we send all the leaseholders out an actual bill. And that might mean they get an invoice, or it might mean they get a credit note, but they can be paying more or less than we charged them originally, because we were charging it based on an estimate. So that means that some people get nice surprises, some people get nasty surprises. Okay. The other big difference between tenants and leaseholders is how repairs work. Okay, so for tenants, repairs costs are covered by the rent, so they get a nice smooth charge over time. For leaseholders, they pay for repairs because we don't run what's called a sinking fund. They pay for repairs as they are incurred. So the day-to-day repairs go out with the main service charge bills. We give an estimate every year, and then we reconcile up at the end of the year. For the major works bills, so that might be if we go into a place and we do lift replacement, or if we replace the windows, anything within the communal areas that the leaseholder is not themselves responsible for repairing, then the leaseholder will get a big bill normally for that. And that can be a very big bill in some cases, depending on the scale of the works. What we do with our leaseholders is that we do have a wide range of payment terms, especially for resident leaseholders. So resident leaseholders can pay interest I think it is over 3 years, if I remember rightly. And then there are various other interest-paying options. And we do have the ability for leaseholders who are in exceptional hardship to go to either a 10-year loan, or in the case of really exceptional hardship, so say you've got an 80-year-old lady who's living on her pension and there's a really big bill coming in, we can just take a security on the property, okay, to cover the bill. So that's leaseholder service charges. I feel as if I've missed something. The cap. Yes, the cap. So in terms of the cap, the regulations around the cap changed back last year, and the cap in London pretty much just applies if you were a local authority who bid for additional decent homes grant money as part of the last round of bidding. Hammersmith and Fulham didn't bid. We had already completed our decent homes standard, and we can go through that whole argument about whether things are decent if they don't have a lift, but technically we'd done our decent homes standard. So the cap doesn't apply to Hammersmith and Fulham leaseholders as is. The cap in London where it does apply is £15,000. It's actually £10,000 out of London. However, what becomes interesting if you start to think about stock transfer is that there are two places the cap applies. It applies in the terms of the Decent Homes Funds, but it also applies for any other assistance that is given for the purpose of carrying out works of repair, maintenance or improvement provided by any Secretary of State or the Housing Corporation, the HCA rather. So that brings to mind the fact that actually if you were going for a stock transfer and we had some form of debt write-off that was partly there to fund maybe the deficit in the repairs, and I don't know whether that would go through currently or not, then you might start bringing caps into play. So that's something we would have to think about. There's also the ability for a local authority to have discretion for hardship and stuff to cap.
Thanks very much indeed for that. I think we'll move on now. And Anthony Wood has got a question. Anthony Wood.
Duncan, how does the council deal with rent and service charge arrears, and how does it perform on rent and service charge collection?
The question, how does it deal with rent arrears? Is make early contact when someone is in arrears, seek personal contact, so telephone or home visit, then seek to engage with the resident, preferably payment in full. If that's not available, then an instalment plan. And then if any support needs are identified, such as vulnerability, then it's refer to the relevant agencies to work with the resident to solve the relevant financial circumstances, to improve the life of the resident, and then enable them to be able to pay the rent arrears. In terms of how do Hammersmith and Fulham perform, over recent years there has been an increase in arrears. That is very difficult to accept for some people across the whole of the country for the rent sector, the fact that rent arrears are increasing in many parts, and it's something quite unusual compared to perhaps 4 or 5 years ago. So just to give an example of that in money terms, the last financial year, if the annual debit, so the total amount of rent due to be charged, approximately 70 million for general needs, a 1% increase is £700,000 increase. The best way to do comparisons with others, because what we've seen is once arrears have started to increase over recent years, organisations are suddenly reluctant to provide benchmarking information because they don't want to share what could be considered as bad news. So what we've done at Hammersmith and Fulham is we meet up every 3 months with a group of other similar organisations with councils and ALMOs in West and North West London. So we're able to get up-to-date comparisons there. So the last check we did, which I think was December last year, the arrears were about 98 point something percent. There were 3 other organisations who also had arrears in the collection, of 98 point something percent. Another 3 had 99, and a couple of others slightly higher. So it is something that we are very conscious of, that we need to continue to improve on. We put plans in place that are already being implemented to address that, so working a lot closer with Housing Benefit. And also in terms of sort of support for residents, last October we identified residents we thought were most likely not to pay the rent over the Christmas period, and we visited 1,200 residents from October to December last year. And with that, with those visits, but before going out to the visits, we worked with a number of different support agencies to put together what we called a menu of support. So when we were knocking on someone's door to explain that there were arrears and please can you pay, if the person couldn't pay, then we went through a menu of support with the resident, such as would you like a referral to our own welfare benefit officer in the team? Are you aware of a debt advice agency? Are you aware of the advice station, which has links to the CAB and so on. The aspect that actually helps support the team is with the council tax support not actually applying within Hammersmith and Fulham, and the reduction as well. So a lot of local authorities are actually finding there's a bit of a double whammy for residents, where you've got a reduction in your council tax support and general pressures with the overall economic climate.
I think actually, Duncan, we may have some more questions to put to you about this. So if you just take a pause there. Anthony, you want to I know Laura's maybe a question along these lines as well. Thank you.
I think, Duncan, you've covered the second question, which was the level of arrears over the last 5 years. What I wanted to ask you mentioned about the support that you give tenants. Have you identified type of tenancies and size of tenancies specifically related to arrears, and how have they changed, and how do you expect them to change in the future?
So in terms of the type of tenancy or profile of resident most likely to be in arrears, the younger you are, the more likely you are to be in arrears. The earlier your tenancy is, so new tenants more likely to be in arrears. Therefore, also when we look at sort of profile of which residents have the highest average arrears, it's actually residents who are in a bedsit or one bed accommodation, which are generally a young single person. So we're developing a lot of work with, particularly with social care, to actually make sure we've got the right support for residents. At the tenancy sign-up now, there is specific support regarding housing benefit to make sure we can get that assessed as soon as possible, and there won't be any gap in the claim at the start of the tenancy.
Okay.
Chair, can I just ask one very brief something?
Very pressing up against the
From memory, you introduced an incentive for people to pay their rent by direct debit. Have you got any figures for how that's worked? Has it decreased? Has it helped? Has it decreased the amount of rent arrears?
In terms of an incentive, I'll see if Kath wants to add anything to that in a moment. I'm aware that something did commence before I joined the organisation in August last year. We are seeking to actually re-promote that again within the next 2 financial years. We know at the moment the actual direct debit take-up is very, very low. So it's about 12%, which is very low compared to other organisations. However, at the same time, we recognise that direct debit isn't a solution to everything. So a lot of residents are reluctant with direct debits with previous experiences where there hasn't been the money and there's been big charges, or some residents have got a post office account that doesn't actually have the facility for direct debits. But we will be picking that up in the next couple of years to promote that as an incentive.
Thanks for that, Duncan. I think we better move on. And Laura, I think you've got a question.
Sister Duncan, you already mentioned what types of support were available for tenants who get into rent arrears. You mentioned things like welfare benefit officer, debt advice. I'm just wondering if there's any support you offer people before they sign their tenancy in terms of managing potential arrears.
Okay, in terms of that, I have had conversations with the team that actually manages residents that first approach for housing and then are on the waiting list, waiting to be rehoused. So they work with the residents, such as I know the Housing Benefit Assist project was specifically set up at 145 King Street to support residents to get all the right benefits in place. And as a consequence, the knock-on from that is if you get things right there, when someone then transfers to their introductory tenancy, then you've already got the support in place, and housing benefit can then deal with that as a change of circumstances.
Okay, well that's good to know. And what types of support are available for leaseholders who get into arrears or debt?
Okay, I think Kath identified a couple of things earlier. In addition to that, we've been working very closely with the Citizen Advice Bureau to make direct referrals, and with that was something that the rent income team led on. However, with obviously all working for Hammersmith and Fulham Council, we've opened that out to the leasehold team as well, so they will be able to make those referrals. I know in terms of support where there are challenges with payments that offer to pay by direct debit, so your estimated service charges over 10 months interest-free. Then there are other plans that are available for the major works bills, and Kath will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think also the council offer loans as well for leaseholders.
Yeah, just to clarify, in terms of the loans for leaseholders, that's about if you've got a major works bill, being able to pay it over a period of time, as stated previously.
Thanks very much, Kath. You've got something else?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, do you think that any of the arrears are attributed to people not understanding their tenancy rights in any way? Or do you think that may have an impact on...
Not in terms of the rights, everyone should be able to understand that the rent is due each week in advance. The information that generally comes out, so for example, the demonstration pilots about paying housing benefit direct to residents as part of preparation for universal credit, for which Southwark was one of the councils in the pilot. The information from that actually showed that generally residents who were not paying the rent to the council, it was solely because of changes to their financial situation, so in and out of an employment. And actually someone can pay for 6 months consecutively, and then for no reason that will stop. But underneath that, you then obviously discover the reason. So someone started a job and waiting for the first pay after 4 weeks, or is out of work and waiting for benefits.
Okay, Anthony Mason, I think.
Thank you, Chair. Duncan, I think this might be another one for you. We're making you work for your supper or whatever. This, however, is a relatively straightforward rent comparison question. So how do levels of rents and service charges charged by Hammersmith and Fulham Council compare with other social landlords, housing associations operating in the borough? And if you know, how do they compare with market rents operating in the borough?
I think you get me again for that one. So in terms of how Hammersmith and Fulham rents are £107 compare on average with other social landlords. In terms of how we compare with other London boroughs, other central London boroughs, we're probably in the bottom, maybe just above the bottom quartile now in terms of what our average rent is. So we're a long way off being the most expensive in terms of average rents. In terms of with housing associations, generally again we're on the bottom end of the scale. In terms of private rents, well, obviously we are massively cheaper in most cases. It is worth just pointing out that there are some tenants who are on rents that were bought in under the previous administration, and the previous administration bought in a different rent policy for rents for properties of 4 bedrooms or more. Okay, so there are some tenants who took on those properties at that point in time who are on rents that were significantly more than target rent. Less than market rent, a lot less than market rent, but still more than target rent. Those tenants are now in the process of moving back down towards target rent, but it's just worth being aware of that, and that distorts our overall average figure a little bit.
Anything more on that, Anthony?
Thank you.
Paul?
Okay, another one for you, Kat. How is ground rent collected, and what proportion of leaseholders pay ground rent to the council?
Okay, all our leaseholders pay ground rent. Ground rent is collected by means of I think it's a once a year invoice. It's £10. So it's as set out under right to buy legislation. So that's a legislative thing. So we can't go and charge our leaseholders more than that. I guess we could have done for some of the void sales that we made, but we chose not to back at that point in time as a council.
Also, how was the recovery of major works costs from the leaseholders achieved, and what level of recovery is achieved in Hammersmith Fulham?
Okay, it's quite difficult to set that out in terms of a percentage recovery compared to a debit in the way that you can set it out for, say, an annual service charge or an annual rent. We do pretty well. We do very well on it. We lose very, 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 very little money by debt becoming statute barred. It's quite unusual for us to do that. And we are generally successful when we end up at First Tier Lands Tribunal. As with all local authorities, we have some old historic stuff that goes back on through the Decent Homes process, where things were maybe not done perfectly, where we haven't been able to collect. But generally, we do okay.
I've got one more as well. In terms of major works and value for money, speaking to one of my neighbours who's a leaseholder, he's had complaints about things being done and it being able to be achieved at a much cheaper cost. What has been done to ensure value for money is actually being achieved?
Okay, this is a really familiar question from leaseholders. So very often you'll have a leaseholder who will say, okay, so you want to charge me whatever it is, say £10,000 to do the works to my property. I've spoken to my mate Bob around the corner and he can do all of this for £5,000, and why can't you go and use Bob? Now there are a couple of points in there. One, as a public body, we have to follow procurement rules. And that's the European Union procurement rules, and that means that we have to go out and we have to do a tender through normally what's known as the OJEU process, which is the official journal of the European Union, and that's quite a complex, big tender process, and lots of stages to it. It takes a long time, quite bureaucratic. Housing associations, by the way, are subject to that as well. So you don't lose that by doing a stock transfer, you're still in that regime. And what that does mean is that one, Bob round the corner probably isn't going to come and bid to us because he probably hasn't got the insurance levels set out in that tender. Two, he probably can't cope with the scale of work that we want to be done because we want to get everything let as one contract. And three, actually, we look at a contract across the whole piece. So while it might be quite possible that the guy around the corner can come and do your windows cheaper, he might not be able to do your roof works as well cheaper, and you might have people coming in and out. And it may be actually, I mean, if you're a homeowner and you're a freeholder, it may be even that you would do some of the works yourself normally. And so that option isn't available. In terms of leaseholders who live in street properties, what we are now doing is where we have street properties that are fully owned by leaseholders, so there are no tenants, we are writing to the leaseholders before we do any works, just to point out to them that they do have the opportunity to enfranchise, so that's to buy the freehold from us, and then they could choose to go to whoever it is around the corner if they wanted to get the work done.
Thank you.
Peter.
Thanks, Chair. A question probably for all of you, I suppose. It's about welfare reform. And I know that probably some of what you've told us already is attributable, certainly on collection performance, is attributable to the impact of welfare reform under the coalition government. But of course, that's the first stages of welfare reform. And I just wondered if I could ask you to tell us what you think the impact in the longer term of welfare reform is likely to be, and in particular the impact of universal credit as it rolls out.
Yes, if you like, the key number of the key aspects from the welfare reform, with being the bedroom tax, that I've always called it, the benefit cap, and also universal credit. So firstly, with the benefit cap, we're awaiting the announcement on the 8th of July regarding what the detail is going to be regarding the fact that it's going to be reduced from 26,000 to 23,000. We've done some initial work there that shows that currently, and obviously it moves each week, there's around about 20 general needs tenants affected by the benefit cap. That's lowered to 23,000, then that's going to put that number up to about 70. That's not anything unusual in terms of other London organisations, but the impact from that is, and I touched upon earlier, the Housing Benefit Assist team, is there's a team in place that's been working with the residents to help support and regarding employability. And you've got a number of resources in to support that, which I know has been successful. But therefore, if the numbers are going to increase by from 20 to about 70, clearly that's going to need additional resources. Secondly, universal credit. The best indicators of the impact will be have come from the pilots of paying housing benefit direct. And they, of course, all vary, different parts of the country, different circumstances. Some organisations would actually switch people back to getting housing benefit when they stopped paying. We've used the, sort of, the modelling or predicting that half of our income comes from housing benefit, so approximately 70 million rent charged a year, half of that from housing benefit, 35 million. Therefore, if 5% of that is not paid by residents onto the landlord in the first year, that would put arrears up by 1,750,000. What we would then expect to see would be to mirror what's happened with the pilots and similarly with the bedroom tax, that over the course of the year that money is then clawed back and the arrears reduce. But clearly the number that I've just mentioned is a significant number which all organisations are faced with. We've just gone through consultation regarding a new structure for the team, and the new structure for the team does respond to that with an increase in resources. When I say resources, officers who manage a patch, so the patches are smaller. And then is increasing the number of welfare benefit officers from 1 to 2, and other aspects supporting, to support residents as well.
Thanks for that, Duncan. Peter, anything more? Can I just for the record, Duncan, what proportion of tenants are on full housing benefit and what proportion on partial housing benefit?
Okay, so in terms of the breakdown of the figures there, of all our residents, 57% of residents are in receipt of housing benefit, of which that accounts for half of the income. I can't recall the specifics in terms of the breakdown, although I may know someone who does.
I think it's about 40% are on full housing benefit. Okay, and just to build a little bit on Duncan's comments on the benefit cap, I think one of the things for us as being a council landlord is that actually when you look at the number of people that get hit by the benefit cap, and it's mostly larger households, it starts to become very difficult to think what will happen to those people if they then can't afford to pay rent in a council home. And just then when you think about that, you think about the general then knock-on impact in terms of people presenting as homeless at some point in future at the council, and then the knock-on costs for council taxpayers.
Thanks for that, Kat. Joanne.
Hi, Duncan, you touched on this a little bit already, but can you say any more about whether the council has a strategy for preventative action in terms of financial inclusion work and also income maximisation for residents and also spanning into employment, help to get into employment, that whole sort of strategic agenda do you have?
Yeah, of course. So in terms current, there is a financial inclusion strategy, although we're currently reviewing that at present. The menu of support that I mentioned, that actually went out with every single rent increase letter at the end of February last year. And we separated that into two areas. So firstly, the support in terms of, for example, debt advice, seeing a welfare benefit officer. And the second aspect is related to employability. So I won't go through the whole of the menu of support, but just for example, on the employability, it has a work zone based in Shepherd's Bush Library. They helped over 800 local people into work in the last year. So when the officers are out across the whole borough, obviously then someone seeking to get back to work can make that referral to say, do you know work zone? If someone says no, do you know Westfield? Yes. Well, it's the library right next to Westfield. That can provide support. Then other aspects, for example, work experience, apprenticeships, the One Place Hub, and so on to support the employability. The other aspect where we supported it within the rent income team is in October last year, we took on 2 graduate trainees or apprentices to help support the employability within Hammersmith and Fulham.
Anything more on that, John?
Well, colleagues, I think we've come to the end of our first session with the officers from Hammersmith and Fulham. Duncan, Kath, Paul, we're very grateful to you. Thank you for your very comprehensive answers, which we've listened to very carefully and will certainly inform our further deliberations. Can I just say a big welcome to members of the public, residents who have joined us in the course of our proceedings. We'll be moving on to the second part of our public hearing in about 10 minutes' time, and in the meantime, let's have a 10-minute break